Spencer Silver was a chemist who specialized in creating adhesives. He set out with a simple goal, to create an adhesive strong enough to be used in aircraft construction. Unfortunately for Mr. Silver, not only was his adhesive not strong enough for airplanes, it was actually categorized as low tack. But years later, his colleague Arthur Fry found a use for it. And together, they gave us something that many of us can't imagine life without, the Post-it note. This redirection shaped the remainder of Silver's career, even getting him inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Silver never got what he set out to achieve, but in the process of doing, he discovered something even bigger. When I heard this year's theme, The Art of Doing, I immediately thought of Silver's story, because it highlights a really strange thing about doing. It doesn't always give us the result we want, but it almost always takes us somewhere we couldn't have predicted. This is precisely why we call it the art of doing, not a science. There is no established standard procedure that can make you do something. The variables in our environment that affect our motivation are completely beyond our control, and most of the time, we usually cannot predict the outcome we get. These uncertainties surrounding the act of doing is often what discourages us, which leads us to two questions. How do we master this art when we lack the motivation or feel like it's the wrong time? And why should we even bother mastering it when we can never be sure of what outcome it will grant us? I'd like to start off with the why. I'd like you all to please raise your hands if you know that feeling when you decide you want to do something and you go full steam ahead only to not get it. I'll be honest, I felt it, and clearly so have most of you. We all know that crushing feeling of disappointment when you work 80-hour weeks and your promotion goes to your colleague who shows up at 12 p.m. Or that anticlimactic moment when you pull all-nighters for a month just to get a B on that test. And I'm sure that in these moments, we've all wondered why we even bother putting in the effort if we're not going to get the results we want. It's the fear of this very feeling that stops so many of us from doing. Why should we do if success can't be guaranteed? Here's where Dr. Silver's story comes in to help. Silver's story allows us to learn that while doing may not always lead us to the outcome we want, it can redirect us towards something even bigger. Because even though we may not always be successful by doing, we will always learn and we will always grow. When we study or work, despite not knowing if our efforts will pay off, even if we don't achieve our initial goals, the skills we gain in the process can still help us in the future, because every step you take does add up. Taking action also builds up our confidence and our resilience. In our lives, when we act in spite of fear, we develop skills and self-confidence that waiting can never give us. The courage we display by taking action not only drives results, but gives us a means to personal growth and the capacity to dream for and achieve even bigger results. Now that we have an idea of why we should do, let's go back to our second question. How do we start doing? Now that we've understood why we feared the act of doing, we need to answer how to get over the fear. As convenient as life would be, if we could resolve a problem just by identifying it, that's not how it works. And while there are many strategies that people employ to stop procrastinating and to start actively doing, I'd like to talk about my favorite. My endorsement of my strategy, the power of irreversibility in creating commitment, started when I heard the story of one of the most famous doers in history. In Cisplain Gaul, 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood facing the river Rubicon with a single Roman legion. And while historians provide different accounts of how much Caesar contemplated this historic moment, the indisputable fact is that he and his army crossed the Rubicon to reach Italy and make the journey to Rome. This bold decision broke the law of imperium and effectively made Caesar a treasonist for challenging the authority of the Senate by commanding an army. Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon was not one he could have made lightly. He knew that committing this act of treason was not one he could reverse. He would have to face a civil war, one that he and his singular legion may not emerge victorious from when faced with the mighty forces of Rome. But by crossing the Rubicon, Caesar went beyond the point of no return. Because he crossed the Rubicon, Caesar and his army did in fact win the civil war. And in his term as consul of Rome, he made some of the most transformative changes that we still speak about today. This famous moment in history has caused the phrase crossing the Rubicon to become idiomatic for going past the point of no return. The saying illustrates that principle that irreversible action often leads to much more success than overthinking and procrastination. Now, as students, we experience our own Rubicon moments. And while our personal Rubicons may be less grand than Caesar's, they are still impactful. We run for leadership positions, start projects, and take the leap to study for a test, not knowing if the effort will pay off. We apply to colleges even when they feel massively out of our league. Trust me, I relate with that feeling. Most of us hesitate. We procrastinate, and we pass it off as waiting for the perfect conditions because we fear failure. From Caesar's example, I would illustrate that taking action, even when hard or frightening, leads to profound change, not just in history, but in our lives. What makes this story so compelling is that it forces us to think about the psychology of action. Why do we hesitate when we're faced with our Rubicons? It's because our brains are wired for safety. As humans, we are far more sensitive to the risk of losing than we are to the possibility of gaining. In this process of loss aversion, we subscribe to the idea that losing something hurts more than gaining something similar feels good. So when we stand at the edge of our Rubicon, fear weighs heavier than opportunity. Now, Caesar didn't have the luxury of safety. Once he stepped forward, the risk became the path. And because of that, he committed fully. In our own lives, we often trick ourselves by thinking inaction is neutral and that waiting is harmless. But history shows us that hesitation is rarely neutral. Inaction has its own costs: missed chances, unrealized potential, and dreams that never move beyond our imagination. From Caesar's example, we have seen how taking the leap and crossing our Rubicon spurred him to fight a civil war, become consul, and then become one of the most impactful leaders who is spoken about even today. It shows us that the irreversible nature of crossing the Rubicon creates focus, responsibility, and commitment. When we don't take action, we think our choices can be undone, which leads most of us into a spiral of procrastination. But once we commit, we discovered that we can adapt, we can stick with our course, and we can learn from the results no matter what they are. In this way, doing something and taking concrete steps creates real change. I'll admit that when I started writing for today, I was daunted by the prospect of having to write a 10-minute long speech. It seemed like a difficult, time-consuming, and frankly, frighteningly important task. But I knew it was a task worth doing. Despite every fiber of my body resisting the act of writing the speech, I chose to commit myself to the task. I forced myself to write the introductory paragraph. That's all I'll do for now. It's not the whole speech, it's just 5 lines. It can't possibly be that hard. Just take the leap. And as I wrote the first 5 lines, I realized that no matter how scary the task seemed, I am up to that mark. Writing that first paragraph was irreversible. It shaped how I thought about the theme we're discussing today, and it could not be undone. This act also made me committed to my task. If I put in the effort to write that first paragraph, why would I quit now when I can stay the course? If I quit now, I'll basically be wasting all the effort I put into the introduction. By taking the first step towards writing the speech, I committed myself to the task and made irreversible progress. This reaffirmed my belief that doing is irreversible, and irreversibility, while scary, is worthwhile. It reminded me that any real progress always requires risk-taking, and that history rewards those who move decisively instead of waiting for the right time, which, let's face it, may never come. And as we remember, even if our actions do fail at first, the growth and learning that we experience from them can help us realize the same or even bigger dreams along the line. The more we do and the more we learn, the more we realize that we are capable of achieving even bigger goals than what we set out to achieve. A short while ago, while I was preparing for this, a friend asked me what I thought would make more people take action. My reply: people would take more action if they knew they would get something out of it. I hope that when I leave the stage today, I have helped convince you that by taking a step, no matter how small, you are making irreversible progress that commits you to your task and drives you forward, not just for this task, but for every task in life. And that even if you believe your efforts were in vain, they gave you the gifts of learning and growth which will stay with you forever. Thank you.